The Wissenswerte series on human rights consists of a general film on this issue and one film on each of the 3 dimensions of human rights. Each dimension is of equal importance in the human rights system. The history of human rights, current human rights violations, as well as women's rights and the role of NGOs such as Amnesty International are also examined. This clip looks at the 3rd dimension of human rights, collective rights. It also shows how the human rights system is developing and highlights the key problems at present. The 1970s. The world has changed considerably. Many former colonies have become independent. But excitement about this newly gained freedom has turned into disillusionment. Many of these countries face massive development problems. The causes are often found in several countries, or even on a global scale. For example, the impact of climate change or an unfair world trade system. The consequences: wars, underdevelopment, corruption, or environmental destruction. Most of these problems cannot be solved by the affected country alone. In response to these problems, developing countries brought 3rd dimension rights into the human rights debate. These rights include the right to peace, the right to a clean environment, a country's right to dispose freely of its own raw materials, and especially important, the right to development. These rights differ from those of the 1st and 2nd dimensions in 2 respects. First, they are intended to protect entire groups, for example peoples, rather than individuals. That is why they are called collective rights. Second, the international community, rather than individual countries, is mainly responsible for their implementation. The ideological basis for this is solidarity among countries. That is why collective rights are sometimes referred to as solidarity rights. The 3rd dimension is more controversial than the first 2. One point often made is that human rights are, by definition, individual rights. That means that they can only relate to individual persons. Some experts also say that 3rd dimension rights will never achieve the same legal and political status as those of the 1st and 2nd dimensions. This gives rise to the fear that the principle of the indivisibility of human rights could be undermined and the entire human rights system weakened. Most industrialized countries were initially opposed to the 3rd dimension. They were afraid that developing countries would make financial demands based on the right to development. However, since the World Conference on Human Rights in 1993, most industrialized countries have supported the 3rd dimension of human rights. Despite criticism, there is now consensus. 3rd dimension rights are an integral part of the human rights system. The 3rd dimension of human rights shows that although human rights are universal, certain rights can change and new rights can also emerge. That may become necessary due to technological developments, for example, advances in genetic engineering or cloning. However, it can also be due to political change. In the case of the 3rd dimension, it is mainly a result of decolonization and globalization. With time, international consensus on such new aspects can be reached. However, that does not mean that every country has to comply or that the rights can even be enforced. For that, the rights would have to be laid down in an international agreement. The rights of the 1st dimension are set forth in the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, while those of the 2nd dimension are contained in the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. Certain rights can also become binding under international law through the adoption of UN conventions. That applies, for example, to CEDAW, or the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. The next step is enforcing rights. What legal steps can individuals take when their human rights have been violated? An international convention requires the signatory states to amend their legislation to include the human rights in question. Victims of human rights violations can then take legal action in their home country. If an individual goes through the courts and does not win, then only 2 possibilities remain. The individual can submit an individual complaint to the treaty bodies. The treaty body then makes a decision. Although this decision is not binding for the complainant's home country, a public decision of this kind can have considerable political weight. No country wants to be portrayed in the media as a human rights violator. This key instrument exists for the 1st and 2nd dimension, as well as for the conventions. It has not yet been established for the 3rd dimension. Another possibility is to submit a complaint to one of the regional human rights systems. The European system is the most advanced. Complaints are frequently submitted to the European Court of Human Rights. Every year, more than 50,000 individual applications from the Council of Europe member states are submitted to this court. The other regional human rights systems are much less developed at present. They offer people few alternatives to the UN human rights system. It's clear that the international human rights system is continually developing. Much has already been achieved, but a lot remains to be done. Some of the most important problems in the human rights system are regional human rights systems, especially in Africa and the Americas, must be strengthened. In regions such as Asia and the Middle East, there are no human rights systems at all. They have to be established. Individual countries and the international community must do more to prevent human rights violations committed by non-state actors. For example, those committed by international corporations, rebel groups, or organized crime. The International Criminal Court in The Hague must be further developed and strengthened. It deals with especially serious human rights violations, such as genocide and crimes against humanity. History has shown that even if the path is sometimes difficult, the human rights system can be extended and further developed. There's more information on this issue in the other films in the Wissenswerte series on human rights.